for NENA for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to talk about our project. Before I start, I'd like to thank my two colleagues, Danny Alexander and Scott Dwyer, who worked with me on the project. And I would also like to thank the La Trobe Valley Authority for funding this research. So just a quick overview of what I'm gonna be talking about. I will give a background on the La Trobe Valley, then outline some research methods and some findings that we get it from the empirical research, and then move on to a couple of international case studies. And then I'll discuss what implications those studies have on the emergency smart grid implication in East Gippsland. So as many of you know, there's a major regional transition that's happening in the La Trobe Valley at the moment. And what I find really interesting about this transition is, this was initiated by the closure of the Hazelwood power plant in late 2016, 2017. And a central player in this transition is the La Trobe Valley Authority, which provides research grants, but more importantly, it really makes community engagement a priority and brings the community together with different stakeholders and industry groups. So on top of this energy transition, East Gippsland was hit quite badly during the Black Summer bushfires. A number of communities were disconnected from the grid, and because of this, there was a loss of basic services, especially in relief facilities. So that led to the idea of developing an emergency smart grid. So just to give you an idea of the Gippsland region, you probably have heard of Malakuta, which is the coastal town that you can see here on your right, but our research area was actually more on the inland region, which is a purple circle, and as you can see, the area was really closed in by the fires. So what's the emergency smart grid? As I said, the energy transition in the La Trobe Valley is very streamlined by the La Trobe Valley Authority. And they developed an innovation group within one of their strategies. And the Voices of the Valley, which is a community group that's been active for a while in the La Trobe Valley, is part of this group. So is the Institute of Sustainable Futures and the East Gippsland Council. So the idea is to use distributed electricity generation to provide basic services in an emergency. For example, just running freezers or purifying water, but also to provide services or benefits all around the year, so beyond the emergency situation. We used a number of different methods during this project. So for the empirical research, we had a workshop and semi-structured interviews with some of the workshop participants. And for the international case studies, we used desktop research and made a number of calls during the selection process for the case studies. So this is one of the outcomes from the workshop. As you can see, it's sort of a stakeholder map, which looks a bit like a donut. And in the center of this donut, you can see the local council and the community. So they're the main groups that are important for the adoption of an emergency smart grid. But then you can see there are a number of red arrows that are pointing towards the Department of Environment at the state level. And so in order to get the emergency smart grid running, there are a number of pathways that are important. So regional development is important, which is what the LVA is doing at the moment, energy policy. but also emergency responses and the management of public buildings and assets. When we talked to some of the workshop participants, they were outlining a number of opportunities and challenges that they see with an emergency smart grid. So one of the opportunities is that solar on public buildings has already been done. So if you use public buildings for the installation of such a system, that would be a really good idea. All structures or buildings that have been damaged by the fire need to be built in a more resilient manner. So the idea is to build back better. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, there should be benefits that are going beyond the emergency situation. And likely there will be battery storage, as solar PV doesn't work very well during a fire, which brings me to the challenges. If an emergency smart grid is installed on a public building or any structure, the structure needs to be defined as safe, and that there needs to be consistency across all government agencies on this definition. There are a number of questions that we couldn't answer during this project, which is on financing, and also there will be questions about maintenance as well, if that's possible at a local level. So if you look at Australia, there aren't really many opportunities for standalone power systems or smart grids. And that's because Australia has so many remote communities. Also at the regulatory level, there has been a rule change. So the Energy Market Commission has implemented a ring fencing waiver, which means that non-network companies can actually replace current grid structures with standalone power systems. The recent fires, and especially the intensity and length of the bushfires, also means that in order to prevent the risk of bushfires, there's a higher risk for building infrastructure in a more resilient way. So standalone power systems will make the recovery cheaper for all participants. So in response to this rule change, there have been a number of network companies that have outlined what the opportunities are for potential sites. So if you look at Western Australia, Western Power has identified 15,000 sites over the next decade to be powered by standalone power systems, which shows you how stretched the grid is. And then moving on to the international case studies, we had 4 case studies, but since time is a bit restricted here, I'm just going to focus on 2. So I'm going to focus on the US and on Europe, in particular Greece. Sorry. So Sonoma County in California, you can see the map here on the right, is highly prone to vegetation fires, or wildfires as they call them in the US. And 2018 has been one of the most severe years for fires, with 700,000 hectares burned and 7,000 structures destroyed, and quite a number of people have died as well. So that's because of climate change, which is one driver, but also poor land management has led to grid infrastructure really being affected by those fires. So the example I wanted to focus on is the Stone Edge Farm, which is a winery and in this area, and they installed microgrid in 2012, which was their aim was to reduce their carbon emissions and sort of expand on their sustainability principles. But as climate change and bushfires became more intense, the idea is really to minimize the reliance on the electricity grid and move off grid as much as possible. So as it stands at the moment, the system is pretty self-contained. They have solar, hydrogen, they have a microturbine, and they have lots of battery storage, and even an EV charging station, which is powered by hydrogen. The system was also put into practice during the 2018 fires, where they were able to remotely control the operation of the winery. And so the winery kept going throughout the fires. At the regulatory level, there's been a change within the Californian Public Utilities Commission, and the commission is considering the standardization of utility-owned microgrids to be as an alternative to the conventional grid. The second example is quite similar. So it's Tilos Island in Greece. And the problem there was, and this is quite similar to a number of microgrid projects in Australia. So the island was powered by diesel generation, which was quite expensive and highly incompatible with tourism. So during the tourist season, the demand would increase and would lead to power outages. So a lot of businesses were out of power for a number of days. And also the entire island is considered national park. So Natura 2000 is the European network that sort of determines national parks or makes something a major conservation area. And so the Horizon project funded this microgrid pilot project in Tilos Island. And they installed a wind turbine, a solar farm, and even an EV charging station. They have a very innovative battery, which is quite insensitive to outdoor temperatures. And part of the business model was to really work closely with the community to meet the community needs, because they're the ones who rely on tourism the most. The project is also really important for other Greek islands, for example, Lesbos, which some of you might have heard about, and they had quite an influx of refugees. So their population was also fluctuating quite a bit. So I'm just moving on to my last slide, which is the implications for the East Gippsland Emergency Smart Grid. So as you saw, many of those projects are quite at a pilot state or bespoke in their nature. Many are funded by public or grant funding, and most microgrids are not designed with an emergency microgrid in mind. The Californian example is probably the most relevant for the East Gippsland region. And yeah, emergency smart grids are quite unique in what they're trying to achieve, but we see quite good applicability worldwide for those ideas. Okay, thank you.